This is a recording for ESM 105. It is October 8th, 2025. And here we are, halfway through the semester if you're not counting the fall break and finals week. So, that's progress. I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things, right? You do have a quiz due on Sunday. All right, quiz 3 covers the week 5 through 6 PowerPoint, which we just wrapped up on Monday. It also has an essay question related to cradle to cradle. I was going through my readings and I needed to get I kind of went online. I was like, I need to find some PDFs of these so I can, access material differently. And I did manage to find most of Cradle to Cradle as a PDF. So I've posted a new page to the homepage of Canvas called Assigned Reading Resources. It's got all but chapter 6 of Cradle to Cradle in it. And then there's this article that the authors published that covers the same material that's in chapter 6. So it's like a substitute for chapter 6. Just in case you don't have the book, here's an option. And I also got a Sound County Almanac up here, which is nice. I don't have PDFs of the other books because they're a little newer. However, the stuff, The Secret Life of Everyday Things reading, I'm currently working on taking a scan of it and converting it into a PDF. You can find that online pretty easily. So feel free to jump on if you don't have that one. It's short. It just talks about some a can of soda. What did it actually take to make the can of soda? What was the resource use like? It's interesting, it's a nice perspective. Okay, so we're gonna get into our week 7 through 8 PowerPoint. Don't forget to continue participating in the discussions. Don't forget to continue working on your annotated bibliography. Check out the annotated bibliography tutorial that I put up on the homepage. Any questions before we get into it? This is the wrong PowerPoint.
Are you gonna grade all the quizzes at the end of the semester, or how is the scores gonna work?
Those quizzes, I've been grading them as we've been going. You should have scores.
Yeah, I don't have
Your grades aren't showing up? Oh my gosh. Okay, let me pause this recording. The recording's resumed, and hopefully that quiz issue, you'll be able to see your grades. They've been graded, I promise. Let's go ahead and get into the week 7 through 8 PowerPoint. Everybody excited? This is our biodiversity PowerPoint. Okay, so the syllabus says this is all about biodiversity this week, and we're going to be really looking at how to maintain biodiversity, the value of biodiversity, some different conservation methods. The last PowerPoint, remember, I ended with, don't forget about these concepts, the ways that we measure diversity, for example, okay? And how there's more to it. We are concerned with how things are clustered and how complex and how connected a food web is, okay? All these different things. So we need to understand how we measure diversity, and those slides are right here. We talked about them in, I think, week 3 or something like that. And those concepts, I'll keep refreshing on them. But let's talk about biodiversity. So I've broken this PowerPoint into species conservation and habitat conservation. So mechanisms for or techniques of maintaining biodiversity, preserving species or preserving habitats. And that's my goal. Let's see how it actually works. I should have warned you about the light adjustment. My apologies, that was a big blast. Okay. So genetic diversity, species diversity, ecological diversity. When we're talking about diversity, it's a nuanced concept. I hope that I've already sort of laid that out for you in our discussions of quantifiable metrics of diversity. And there's variability here. So sometimes you're concerned with genetic diversity. Sometimes you're concerned with just the diversity of the number of species or the relative abundance of the different species. And sometimes you're concerned with ecological diversity, which usually breaks down into a discussion of functions, like ecosystem functions, and which organisms are carrying out which functions. Is there an abundance of decomposers, or are there no decomposers in that ecosystem? Or is there one decomposer? You know, stuff like that. So we've talked about species diversity. Did we do these slides last time? I don't think we did. It just feels like it because, you know, the last slides kind of talked about this. So how do we measure biodiversity? Species richness, species evenness, both concepts we've talked about, right? Evenness is a measure of how evenly represented each of the species is in a community. Species richness is just a measure of how many individuals there are, individual species there are in a community. Any questions about this? I know I'm hitting it a lot, but it's one of the main learning objectives I have for you in leaving ESM 105 is to have a better grasp of how we measure diversity so you can discuss it. Cool? Okay. Speciation and the biological species concept. We talked about this a while ago. All right. How individuals that can breed and make viable offspring are considered as members of the same species. That's the biological species concept. Okay? Viable offspring are those that then can go on to make offspring of their own. There's always overlap here. There's always some gray areas. Okay? And it always still feels silly for me because I'm of a certain age to say Liger because, you know, it just sounds silly and it's from Napoleon Dynamite. Yeah, thank you so much. People still watch that movie. That's great. It makes me very happy. But the Liger is a great example of this because a tiger and a lion can breed and they can make an offspring, okay? But that offspring can't go on to make viable offspring of its own unless human intervention comes in. You can do in vitro fertilization and implantation, and you can get 2 ligers to make a viable liger. But the question now is, well, is that a biological species now? Because they can't naturally breed, but you see where there's just gray areas. There's always gray areas there. So reproductive isolation, we've spoken about a little bit. Allopatric versus sympatric speciation, we also spoke about, just as a refresher. Sympatric speciation occurs when a single species inhabits a certain area, and then something happens to make them stop reproducing with one another, but they still live in the same area. So it's the same habitat, sympatric speciation. In allopatric speciation, something happens to separate a population, to split up a population, that reproductively isolates them, and then they go on and reproduce, and natural selection acts separately on each group, and they become so different that they can't breed anymore if they were brought into proximity. All right? Cool? So this figure here focuses on allopatric speciation, but sympatric speciation can also happen. I love it. So, environmental DNA, that's what I'm trying to hint at here. If you're talking about maintaining genetic diversity or you're trying to do surveys for genetic diversity, you're not always just interested in how many individuals there are, right? You're often interested in the genetic diversity of that population. So that's where genetic techniques come in. You get some samples of tissue, you amplify them via PCR, you sequence them, you look at how similar the sequences are, and that gives you a rough idea of genetic similarity or dissimilarity. You might decide to amplify and target specific regions of the genome, all right, and get through the results faster that way. You might want to get samples from the environment. That's eDNA, they always call it, okay? Let me get my dang. And have you spoken about that in any of your classes? It's modern, cool sampling stuff. eDNA, all right? It's environmental DNA. So with modern techniques, you could take a sample of water and just collect DNA out of it amplify it, and get some idea of the species that are there. So it's a useful technique. Yeah, solid. And it's great because you can tell how many different individuals there are too. Like if you sample hair that you find stuck to a fence or stuck to a tree or something like that, and you sample another piece of hair, you determine if that's the same bear or two separate bears. Anyways, environmental DNA, DNA in the environment. It's cool. Standard issue stuff, all right? Introduction of any conservation book, introduction of any environmental science textbook. It'll be like, hey, you know, there's a lot of species, all right? There are fewer species than there used to be. Extinction risks, all this stuff, right? Certain areas of the globe contain a lot of biodiversity or many species, and certain areas of the globe are relatively species poor. Question?
We get a lot of species, or not, hypothetically, a lot of species would die off monthly, daily, yearly, blah, blah, blah. How often do we find new species?
So the question is how often we discover them or how often they speciate?
I guess both. But
Both?
Like,
So speciation rates definitely don't keep up, well, not definitely, but they don't keep up with extinction rates. I don't have a good number for you for the speciation rates, unfortunately. And discoveries of new species tend to go in pulses, and it's usually insect species
so they
nowadays.
Really, like, correlate.
Well, not perfectly, right?
We're not discovering new species because they're speciating. We're discovering them because somebody has funding or somebody asked.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I guess he kind of covered what I meant in the first section of your answer.
Oh, with the speciation rates, yeah.
That's kind of,
Yeah.
There's more things dying off than, like,
The new species are coming up.
than are being speciated. That's the word.
Yeah, absolutely true. And yeah, usually with discovery of new species, it's a big funding project, and it's often, hey, we're gonna go into a tropical forest and we're gonna look at bugs. You know, sometimes they just shake trees and put a net under the tree. And that's like, that's your research project, and you go out there and you're guaranteed to discover like 20, 30 new insect species during your project. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
There's a guy that I saw a little documentary clip of. He lives near a meadow and he just goes out at night with a net and just swishes through the grass, like shakes tree branches. And
Yeah.
goes back and identifies new species like everything.
Oh yeah, and that's a way to get, and it's a way to churn out publications like crazy, you know? Like a newly described species of blank in blank region. And that's a publication, you put out like 10 of those a year and your career's made, you know?
Common to, like, think you found something new, but it's just like a variation of something else.
Yes, and then so that really brings us to the genetic testing piece, and then what your species concept is. So it's easy enough to discover something, well, not easy enough, right? What I mean is you discover something new, and you say, oh, it's very different than anything that's previously been described. But now your question is it a new biological species? Can it breed with something closely related to it? Or is it a variety or a subspecies? Meaning it can still breed, but it's got significant differences from other members of the species. And this actually brings up a really good point. I'm not sure if we've talked about it in our class before, but this whole concept of subspecies, varieties, and cultivars, you hear people throw about all the time, like, oh, it's a subspecies. And it's like, why is it a subspecies? You know? Who defined it as a subspecies and under what criteria? Because it's different all the time. It's different all the time, okay? Different groups have different criteria for determining something's a subspecies. And determining something's a variety is even easier, you know? And then determining something's a cultivar just means that we've been selecting it to have some different characteristics. It might still be part of the same species and still able to breed. Only the biological species concept is actually fully defined, all right? In that they can breed, they're members of the same species. Subspecies, all that. But those are very, very important for conservation purposes, okay? I know I talked to you about the giraffes at one point, how there's a subspecies of giraffes in Africa. They're an isolated population. They can breed with the other giraffes, which are not endangered, okay? But this isolated population is very small, and it's endangered. But if we just consider it as the same species of giraffe, then there's no protective measures. There's no funding for protecting giraffes because they're not endangered, see? But now you say it's a new subspecies, you put that out there, and you can get funding to protect that giraffe's habitat. All right? Anyways, it's interesting stuff. Okay, some biodiversity hotspots on the globe. They tend to be areas that are warm and areas that have plenty of water. You'll see these sync up pretty well with the discussions that we've had about air movement and where there's humidity available and where the solar radiation's hitting. It's a pretty straightforward correlation here. If temperatures are warm enough and you have enough water, you tend to get a good amount of biodiversity. Okay? So, conservation. Every ecology class I teach, of which I teach 4 now, if we're including this as an ecology class, needs to have this piece of why do we carry out conservation? And it's a little bit like, I always feel kind of silly giving this portion of the lecture, because you're trying to justify that the planet that we live on has a lot of diverse organisms on it that evolved to work together in these complex ecosystems well before we were around. And destabilizing all of that, but assuming that we can make up for that destabilization with technology or translocation of species or something, it's just a little bit, it's probably a little bit inaccurate, okay? And also, there's the economic piece of why would you make all of that extra work for yourself, of having to now compensate. So we carry out conservation efforts. There's a difference between preservation and conservation. Conservation implies some sort of more active management and control, whereas preservation usually means leaving it alone, letting it just do what it does, leaving an area, cordoning it off, and saying, humans don't go in there now, all right? Now this can bring up issues with indigenous peoples who live in those areas that are now designated as nature preserves, and now we say, humans don't go in there. And, that can be kind of a problem, because they're there already, and you're just booting some people out. So anyways, conservation, preservation, we're going to talk about it. One of the things that we've already talked about is ecosystem services. There are natural processes in the environment, things like carbon sequestration, water filtration, nutrient cycling, all these important aspects that we can approximate, okay? We can approximate natural nitrogen fixation cycles using like the Haber-Bosch process and making nitrogen fertilizers. But it's not the same as a healthy functioning ecosystem, which carries out these ecosystem services for free. Anyways, there we go. What is conservation? Why is it necessary? There's the straight up practical viewpoint of stable environments around us help to maintain stability on the globe and allow us to survive and persist. It's very pragmatic. So we just set up preserves, we set up conservation efforts, and that's great. There's also, of course, cultural value, there's religious value to these areas. So that's another reason to carry out conservation and preservation efforts. So there's cultural value, there's health value, there's economic value, there's resource value of if you don't manage the taking of resources from the environment and do it in a sustainable way, then you deplete the resources, you collapse the ecosystem, and then those resources are no longer available, for example. Question?
You see there's like aesthetic value or like
100%. It's like, yeah, absolutely. It's like quality of life value. If there's no more green areas to go to, then there's a mental health decline. I mean, there's lots of research to show that you get greater mental health from people who are experiencing nature in some way. Have y'all heard about the savanna hypothesis? It's really cool. It's really super interesting about like why we like open spaces and views of large bodies, like large areas of grass that are open. And it's like, oh, we used to be prey animals, and so having an open space makes us feel secure. And so just that natural, like, that's free anti-anxiety medication. That doesn't have to lead to the same cognitive decline that you see with some medications, which is great. It's free if we, don't consider the fact that you could make a bunch of money by building high-rise apartments in the field, So anyway, you read Sand County Almanac. He talks about the responsibility for stewardship and just like, it's kind of our job now that we have the power to destroy all this stuff to try to conserve it as best we can. Okay. Ecosystem services provided by the ecosystem, usually not fully understood because ecosystems are complex systems. All right, cool. There's some estimates about putting a monetary value on this, and it's like, okay, if we lost the natural ecosystem services and had to purify the water and generate all the nutrients to resupply to the soils and deal with all this on our own, it'd cost a lot of money. And could our technology keep up with it? Who knows? So we've got some examples of ecosystem services. Solid. Okay. And this gets to your aesthetic, cultural benefits as well, right? Ecotourism is a huge thing. Some economies survive and thrive because of ecotourism. And ecotourism is a great way to get communities to adopt conservation practices, because tourist money brings a lot into the economy. You maintain the natural ecosystem. People like it. They go to see it. You try to prevent those people from destroying it when they visit it. And there you go. You've got a conservation. You have incentives for conservation there. Okay. So very good ecotourism, and then intrinsic value. This is all, I'm assuming, stuff that you've seen or heard or read in one of the books that's been assigned to you at some point, and you're in this class, you're in the ESM program, so I'm assuming I don't have to do a ton of work to convince you that at least some degree of conservation and preservation is necessary. Now, what we can discuss is the degree to which we manage and conserve natural ecosystems, and the degree to which we set up preserves, and how much human activity we want to allow in these areas, and then how to interact with the agencies that actually administer funding, and how we deal with private versus public land, how much conservation is actually possible. We can talk about all that for sure. Yeah.
I have a comment about this because it's kind of me thinking about the current time with like the government shutdown, and making me think about like how like there might be like a lot of big like government like branches that like focus on like conservation and like stuff like this, like preserving biodiversity, right, or conserving biodiversity, and like how it's like maybe like it's kind of like taking away from that,
Yeah.
They're trying to sell the lands.
Ecology.
They're trying to sell off the forests, the public lands.
Like the national parks, right?
Yeah. I think the BLM's doing a lot, trying to do that a lot, right? That's the current push.
They're trying to bring back cut and run from the Reagan era.
Yeah, it's it's definitely going to have some impacts, So that's the issue with these with the agencies carrying out conservation, preservation, they can always those protections can be lifted, And if it's a conservation project that requires intervention, and then the agencies that are doing the intervention to manage the ecosystem go away, then, or become inactive because of a shutdown or something like that, then those conservation efforts aren't going forward. And if the ecosystem needed to be managed to maintain health, now the health of that ecosystem can decline. You see. So these are all things to consider, especially when you're just talking about the divide between a preservation and a conservation effort. You know, a preservation effort is like you just say don't go there, you know.
Yeah.
But a conservation effort involves some actual intervention, human intervention. And it's usually because of previous human activity, and now we're trying to get it back to a functioning, stable state. Yeah, it's a very valid point. Diversity stability hypothesis. So it's standard to say, like, here's the thing. I'm gonna approach this slightly differently. Okay? If you are proposing a conservation or a preservation project, you need to have something that you can measure to say that the project worked. Okay? If you want people to do a similar project in the future, or if you want to just justify the project now, and if you want to figure out what you're going to track, as I said before, to determine if the project worked this time. Okay? And it's usually diversity, some measurement of species diversity. There are plenty of other things to measure, as shown in these previous slides. You know, you could measure soil aspects, you could measure nutrient cycling, you can measure all these other carbon sequestration, you can measure all these other things. You could survey people and see what they think about the aesthetic benefits of the conserve or the park. You could measure economic activity through ecotourism, and if it goes up or down after you institute the conservation practice, right? These are all things you can measure, but one of the standard things that we measure is diversity. And as I've covered already, we can measure diversity in a number of different ways. Now, the justification for using diversity as such an important metric comes from this work in the 50s, all right here, that led to the diversity stability hypothesis. And the diversity stability hypothesis is pretty simple. It just states if the community is more diverse, then it's more stable. It can handle disturbance better, all right? So if the ecosystem's complex and it provides services that we can't fully understand, and it operates in ways that we can't fully understand, then what we really want is a resilient ecosystem. We want a stable ecosystem. What's something that we can measure to see if a community is going to be stable, if an ecosystem is going to be stable? According to this hypothesis, diversity. All right? Now, the diversity stability hypothesis makes a lot of sense intuitively. But I'm hoping that as we've talked more about what we actually measure for diversity, you might see how, well, diversity doesn't tell us that much, just the number of species and how evenly each species is represented. That's really all diversity tells us. So, the diversity stability hypothesis does not always work. It doesn't tell us how many invasives or non-invasives there are. Okay, for example, this map here shows a correlation between the number of non-native species and the number of native species. So if an area is becoming enriched in invasive species, its diversity is increasing, but it's losing its natural state, right? And the natural state is maybe what we're trying to maintain because it's a complex system and we don't fully understand all of its benefits. Cool? All right. So the conventional wisdom is that a simple or low diversity community can be more easily upset. All right. It's more sensitive to oscillations in populations, and it's more vulnerable to invasion by non-native species. And I put this point right here that really the greater risk to diversity, the greater risk to maintaining ecosystem services. My concern is I want everybody to be able to, live and be comfortable and have good air and water. Like that's me, that's what I'm really worried about. And so I point out that one of the real great risks here is biotic homogenization. okay? That you could have the entire country have a very high diversity, but what if it's all made up of the same 120 species? And the same 120 species are present in every state, and it's all high diversity, you know, good evenness, all that stuff we want, but there's no variability across the country, or no variability across each state. So that's a phenomenon known as biotic homogenization, when the living component of the system is the same, all right? So what we're really trying to do is maintain heterogeneity, okay? Maintain difference across the globe. Maintain difference on smaller scales. Maintain the natural diversity of ecosystem types and diversity of habitat types and the differences in species compositions. Does that make sense? I hope I've laid down the groundwork okay of like, diversity can be a loaded term, and it can be used differently, okay, by different groups, different agencies. Okay, awesome. Nice terminology slide. These are great when you're taking notes because it's like, okay, I'm just going to write down these two definitions. I always liked these when I was a student because I could just read all the information, you know? And I just kind of zoned out and didn't listen to the person who was like doing this. But I've already said this stuff. Preservation, conservation. Conservation is what we call an active management practice, okay? Where you are actively maybe doing something as extreme as culling predators from the population, okay? You're literally going out there and distributing hunting licenses and trying to get people to hunt certain organisms because you're actively managing this area and you determine there's too many deer. All right, so that's an example of a conservation effort. Active management practices, okay? Preservation, leave it alone. Let it do its natural thing. Leave it unused, uninhabited, and unmanaged by human activities. Preservation versus conservation, how we feel? The delineation. Okay, very good. Preservation, you need a lot of space to do preservation efforts, all right? Preserves themselves, there's do I have the slide coming up? It'll come up in the habitat conservation section of this PowerPoint later. But nature preserves need to be big, all right, in order to buffer the effects of the surrounding areas and maintain stability, even in the face of natural disturbance, all right? If you're just letting the natural processes occur, then there's gonna be certain regions of the area. The principle is called dynamic equilibrium, all right? Where you've got, what is this called? A table, I think. If this table is an area of habitat, right? You have disturbances that are occurring dynamically, and they are setting portions of the habitat back in succession. So the entire habitat region is proceeding through the stages of succession, but you've got this area that's close to climax, then it gets a fire and it goes down here. But this area is still proceeding in climax, and there's a fire here. And so everything is dynamically moving towards the climax community or moving through succession and regularly being set back by natural, normal disturbances. So in a large area, on average, it can handle that, right? The community composition here can then colonize this area when the disturbance clears it. You see what I'm saying? So dynamic equilibrium is a more modern concept. It's still old, but it's a more modern concept about succession. Yeah?
So how do you preserve something without like actively protecting it?
That's a great question.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah, because you have to actively protect, you have to actively like have people protect what you're trying to preserve.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like they're kind of like, with the active management practice, you're still kind of actively managing it.
So usually the cutoff is like, if you're doing a preserve, you have to prevent like human encroachment or something like that. Yeah. And it's not usually entirely possible, especially if there's valuable resources that can be taken out of that area. You see? So but if you're really actively managing it, you are not so much actively managing human activity, you're actively managing the living, the non-human living and non-living component of the ecosystem.
Okay.
Do you see kind of what I mean?
So if you're actively managing the perimeter, that's different.
I mean, everything's got gray areas here, right? Ideally, you would set the preserve aside and they'd be like, that's a nature preserve, don't go in there.
Yeah.
But in reality, you're still patrolling the nature preserve, you're looking for humans going in there and clearing space out or harvesting resources or poaching or doing something like that. So that would then be an active management practice, right?
Yeah.
So there's always crossover on here. But the concept behind establishing it is what's different. That's the thing to really point out, is if you're establishing a nature preserve, you're trying to set up a system without human impacts. If you're establishing a nature conservation area or a conservation area, right, then you are trying to set up a zone where you are going to carry out specific active management practices to attempt to maintain ecosystem health. It's all about your goal at the beginning. Does that make more sense? Awesome. I love it. So preserves work best when they're big. We'll talk about the single large or single large or some small or multiple small. It's called SLOSS is the acronym. But the question is, do you want to have a big nature preserve or do you want to have a bunch of little nature preserves? And we'll talk about that as we get into habitat conservation, which is more tied to it. I've talked to you about buffer zones and core areas a little bit on the board, but I'm going to, when we get into habitat conservation, talk about it with slides and images. All right? So don't worry, it's coming. Conservation. Okay. Conservation, you got to make value-based decisions. So conservation projects are inherently, you're choosing what's important to conserve. You're choosing you're making decisions about which species need to be encouraged and which species need to be discouraged. All right, it's going to have some aspect of human values. There can be things like you have this area of the conservation area in the buffer zone, you are allowed to harvest this much lumber out of it each year. So it's not necessarily, it's not at all removed from human impact. You're trying to manage that human impact. Question?
Actually, no, but I just wanted to say it's 3 minutes and we still haven't gotten those grades.
Oh yeah, sick, good call. This is a perfect place to wrap then. We are wrapping on the conservation slides. It's actually really great because here's what we're going to be getting into on Friday. We'll talk about species versus habitat-focused conservation. Are you very impressed by my animation? I know, it's incredible. So we're going to get into this on Friday. I'm going to start banging my head against Canvas and trying to get it to show you your dang quiz grades. Apologies again, and thank you for bringing that to my attention. All right, thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to end the recording.